Hello, my name is Michael Pollack, author of Healing Through Grief, Finding Freedom from Depression. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about the relationship of suicide to loss, grief, and depression. In the book Healing Through Grief, I talk at great length about the relationship between loss, grief, and depression and how they interrelate. And so today I'm going to be adding the dimension of suicide. A number of people indicated that that would be really helpful to really understand how they're all related. I think for most of us, most people are aware that depression and suicide are certainly often related to one another. You hear about someone who, before they committed suicide, they were very depressed. It's very common. And so before I go any further, I do want to say that, when someone commits suicide, number one, if they succeed, I have no way of interviewing them, so we can't really ask them what was going on. Sometimes there's a note, and sometimes there's, they talk to someone ahead of time, but after the fact, we have no insight into what happened. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about the relationship between these things, but please understand, I'm not covering all cases. That's impossible. But it's going to be something to look for if you're faced with someone who is contemplating suicide, or if you want to have an understanding, if you want to be able to look at, if you know someone who's already committed suicide and you sort of want to have an insight into what happened, what I'm about to talk about may help. So briefly, I want to talk about just a little review of what is in the book and the relationship between loss, grief, and depression. If you want a more in-depth treatment of it, by all means, Healing Through Grief, Finding Freedom from Depression by Michael Pollack. It's a great read. In the book, we talk about how, what is a loss? And for our purposes, we sort of look at it as I have a projected future, right? Based on my past, I know kind of what's coming up, right? What's going to be there tomorrow. And sometimes the world throws me a curveball and there's something that my car gets totaled, or someone dies, or I lose my job, lose a relationship, any of those types of things. Those are the big ones. Not I lose a quarter. That's small potatoes. That doesn't take a whole lot of work. But one of those things where there's something shows up as a big loss in my life, and from which I can, for most people's accounts, we'd say, and after that you would experience grief. And from my point of view, when I talk about this in the book, how really what happens is the symptoms of grief and depression are basically the same. We call it grief when we sort of understand what the antecedent was. We understand that there was a loss that occurred, and so we say, you're grieving. From my point of view, it's like, you experienced a loss, you're in this state of depression, and the way out is the grieving process. That's the crux of the book. So those are the cliff notes. If you miss the book, those are the cliff notes. So, what causes the depression? And again, in the book, we talk about how it's the discrepancy between my future, the way I thought it would be, and the way that current reality is. So when I get the information that, for example, someone has died, right? Well, up until that point, I was pretty sure they were going to be around tomorrow. And now that's not the case. And so I now have to work with this discrepancy that occurs in the mind, and then it manifests through the emotions, the emotion of a depressed, sad state. If you have an understanding of how that works, and you understand that there's a gap that occurs between that projected or fantasy future and current reality, and that the resolution comes through letting go of the old future or the projected future, the fantasy future, and that's really the process of grieving, is letting go of that, and so that you have one future before you that closes the gap, that releases the discrepancy. So done successfully, you come into a state of acceptance, life is good. In the case of suicide, well, how does this all relate, right? We know depression and suicide are certainly related, and you've just told me that depression really comes from a loss of some sort, right? And this, you can call it grief if you want to, but it's like, it just means that we know what it's about, and that grieving, releasing that old future, is the way out of it. how does suicide come into play? So in my experience, and I'll tell you that, in my personal experience, my grandmother committed suicide, and I certainly contemplated it at one point in my life. And from my point of view, the way that this works together is when you experience a loss that is a loss of identity, that is the type of depression that can lead to suicide. And I wouldn't even say depression leads to suicide. It really is the loss of identity that is the antecedent. Depression is one of the symptoms. Right? If you understand that depression is a natural emotional consequence of experiencing a loss. But in the case where it's a loss of identity, I'll start out depressed, but if I cannot resolve the discrepancy between the two futures, if I cannot find a way to accept myself in the current reality where I am and create a new identity for myself, if I cling to the old identity and it just is unworkable, then my current future, like, I can't see into it, and I can't see beyond. I don't have a future anymore. And then without that, I can start thinking about, well, would it be better if I weren't here? So in particular, in my case, my experience with suicidal thoughts was when I was going through the coming out process. My idea of myself and who I believe myself to be, which is, from my family of origin, I grew up Catholic. And so I assumed that I would grow up, and if I didn't go into the priesthood or something like that, that I would certainly get married, have children. That was the way that it worked. And even when I would say there were signs that maybe my life wasn't going that way, but I clung to that old idea of who I was, and I will tell you that I was in denial, and we talk about denial and how that functions in the book as well. And it wasn't until I was faced with what I would say was a very sharp, like an incident in my life where I betrayed a friend of mine, and it was devastating to me. But more importantly, I had to wake up to the reality that I was not who I thought I was. And it's I'm not who I think I am. That'll send you for a loop. That will cause a spin out. So, at that time, initially you would say this person is in a severe state of depression, right? Acute depression. I was crying. I was an absolute mess. And I was also contemplating suicide. I was very fortunate. I had a friend of mine who dragged me to the counseling center and fortunately staved off my succeeding. So here I am today. I did not commit suicide. But it was that loss of identity that really was the trigger for me. And it was simply the notion that I'm not who I think I am. My integrity was shattered. My actions could not possibly have come from the person who I thought I was, and so I must be someone else, and I didn't know what that was, didn't know what it meant, and I could not see more than a few hours in front of my face. I had no future. So in my grandmother's case, I would say I was not. My other family members told me she had been depressed for a while. I was away at college and I wasn't really around to see it. My experience was, when I was walking with her at one point and she made the comment, "I guess you're wondering how an old woman could be walking so slow." And I'd never heard her talk like that in her life. To me, she was always, this vibrant person. And yes, she was aging, but, to me, that didn't matter. She was still, this wonderful, lovely, vibrant, and just gracious person. And, it went in one ear and I went, this makes no sense, and I didn't really recognize the sign that somewhere inside of her identity was changing and shifting, and she was now seeing herself as aging. And I don't know if she had health challenges going on. I don't know, but it was maybe a month or two after that she ended her own life. But I would say, from my perspective, from what I could see, it seemed like there was a loss of identity there, a loss of her identity, of the way that I saw her anyway, as this young and vibrant person. 60 is the new 40, that kind of thing. So if you understand the model that the loss of identity is really what is going to lead to the suicide, you understand that one of the manifestations that you see is the natural emotional consequence of depression, right? That's an outward manifestation. The suicidal thoughts is another manifestation. So it's not that depression leads to suicide, it's the loss of identity that will take you to suicide, right? Loss of any kind will take you to depression. So that's why, like, some people are depressed, but there's no suicide involved. It's not a loss of identity. If it's the loss of a loved one, a loss of relationship. Now, if your identity is wrapped up in the relationship, if your identity is wrapped up in your job, then you can start having it going down the route of suicide. I know of at least one person who they had built a company from scratch, from the ground up, and run it for many years. And then at one point, the company failed, right? Due to the economy or something like that. And sometime later, they committed suicide because they could not, it's like, I don't know who I am without my company. I am the company is me. And there was no separation. That was their identity. And without that, what's the point? And so, I was speaking with a family member about, what happened. They were simply telling me about all of these things that led up in the months that led up from the loss of the company and how they felt about that, and they were unable to create a new future for themselves. Why is this important? So, as with any loss, when you're in the state of depression, in healing through grief, we talk about it's healing through grief. Or said another way, the grieving process is the way out, right? The grieving process is the healing agent that allows for the closure of the gap between the old future, the projected future, and the current reality. Well, if the gap is one of identity, a loss of identity, the solution is similar. It's about grieving the old identity, letting go of the old identity, which is no longer compatible with current world reality. In my case, I'm like, I had to learn what it meant to be, a gay man in the society in which I was living. And I will tell you, I wasn't happy about it at the time. Much more comfortable with it now. But at the time, it's like I remember thinking, it's like a little ways afterward, thinking, oh my God, I'm in the club, but nobody's giving me the passwords, right? I didn't know how to function that way. I didn't know. And I for quite some time, I still tried to, behave as though that wasn't the case, but I had to come out of denial, and I had to create a new future for myself, one in which my relationships were going to be very different than the way that I had thought they would be. So for me, it's like, if I'm working with someone who has suicidal thoughts and they're depressed, what I want to look for is, what's the source of the depression, right? Was there a loss involved, right? There are different sources of depression. It's not always this type of thing. But when this is what you're working with, when you're working with a loss and then working with the loss of identity, I want to look for that. Will the person tell me? And usually, if you ask the right questions, they will tell you what they're depressed about, what was lost, and if it's an identity, it's like, who did I believe myself to be before, and in my current reality, who am I now? And at that point, it becomes more of a process of discovery. And if I'm still clinging to the old identity, that can be very difficult to see. So part of it is assisting a person in grieving the old identity, in learning to let go of and unravel and dismantle the old identity, because it's not who you were anyway, right? It's who I believed myself to be, but it wasn't true, or unhooking my identity from, say, the job or my financial position, or from another person, like, as though, who am I without this person? So if I can do that and successfully unravel that piece of it, then the opportunity is to create a new future and create a new identity. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. So, and that one hopefully more grounded in reality, but you're like, wait a minute. Well, what if I just end up creating another one that is another, fantasy that isn't really who I am? And I'm like, yes, that's one of the dangers. If you're willing to do the work, going and looking at who am I really? Who am I underneath all of this? And for many people, that will lead you on to a spiritual quest. It certainly did for me. Within a couple of years of having those suicidal thoughts, I packed my bags, moved across the country, and started really looking at and doing some personal growth and development work and going, okay, who am I now? And how am I going to create this new life? So hopefully at this point I've given you an understanding of the relationship between the loss, grief, depression, and suicide. And also, some tools for working, if you happen to be working with someone who you think might be depressed and contemplating suicide, I would say, you want to look for what's the source of the depression. Is it a loss? Is it a loss of identity? And then assisting the person in a letting go of that old identity. And again, it's not easy. It can be very difficult. But I think it helps if you understand the relationship and if you understand what's going on, because it gives you a place to focus. I hope you find this video helpful. Feel free to leave a comment below. If you have a question, I will do my best to answer it. Thank you again. And if you haven't read the book, Healing Through Grief, Finding Freedom from Depression by Michael Pollock, look it up. It's a great read.